Yeah, so we'll start with a bit of an introduction on Earth for All and why we've conducted this survey, the rationale for it, building on a survey from 2021 led by Global Commons Alliance. Then Mia from Ipsos will present the key findings of the survey, and we'll talk about what the results mean for in this particularly important year on policy, with G20 meetings, with many elections happening worldwide, and in an election cycle where we have to make very dramatic, extraordinary action on climate change and protection of nature this decade. Do we have the support for that? Do we have, how much support is there across the G20 for economic systems transformation and political systems transformation? So we'll talk about that, and then we'll do a Q&A with you all, and then closing remarks. Thank you, Lena. So shall I share my screen now? So I'll just take you through a few minutes on Earth for All, then I'll pass over to Zoe from Global Commons Alliance on the GCA perspective. I'm hoping we can share. This is working. Okay, cool. So essentially, Earth for All, the starting point for Earth for All is 50 years ago, when the Limits to Growth report was delivered to the Club of Rome, and they're using one of the first system dynamics models to look at the state of the planet. And one of the key scenarios they looked at was a collapse scenario and the risk of collapse, societal collapses later this century. And we have been following Earth, the societies, we have been following that trajectory most closely over the last 50 years. We wanted to look at, and we can see the impacts of this already. We're crossing 6 of 9 planetary boundaries, and we're seeing many fractures in societies. Today, we face these huge risks. We wanted at Earth for All to bring together system dynamics modelers, including Jürgen Randers from the original report, along with some of the world's leading economists, to look at how do we avoid that fate? What will it take to have a giant leap, a significant transformation of economic systems, to stay within planetary boundaries? Is it possible? What will it take? And can we have a safe trajectory this century? So we looked at 2 scenarios, one called Too Little, Too Late, which is essentially covering the scenario we're on at the moment, where we are making some progress, albeit limited, on climate change. Emissions trajectories are changing. The energy transition is happening, but slower than we hoped. We're not anywhere near the kind of milestones we need to be hitting at this stage to avoid the worst. Or the giant leap scenario. What if we take some extraordinary turnarounds, and what would that look like? Is it possible to feed 10 billion people within planetary boundaries? So essentially, using that system dynamics modeling, we have established that on the current trajectory, we'll hit around 2.7 degrees. GDP will continue rising. Population will eventually peak at 9 billion or so by 2050, but we're likely to cross tipping points. We will see rising inequality. As a result of that, we'll see rising social tensions in the model, and extreme poverty will still persist in society until the end of the century. Essentially, we'll be creating fragile societies that will be unable to deal with the climate. Alternatively, with the giant leap scenario, we see a peak of 8.5 billion people around 2040, rising GDP still, where emerging economies, their economies grow, and as we move to green economies, we see rising GDP, growth in the energy sector there. But we stay below 2 degrees with 0 emissions by 2050. We're falling inequality, rising well-being, and we're able to deal with that. Gives us resilience in societies. We're able to deal with many of the problems that we're going to be facing. And we reach close to zero poverty in one generation. Still, we have a rough ride ahead of us. It seems likely we will be crossing some tipping points, at least this century. So we need to build resilient societies able to cope with what change is in some ways inevitable now. We brought together a group of economists who are looking at post-growth, green growth, mission economies, well-being economics, beyond GDP, donut economics. What were the kind of models that are most likely to deliver on what we need? And from that, we identified 5 transformations that society will need to take this century. This is the kind of minimum viable product for a stable society, related to food, to energy, to poverty, empowerment, and to inequality, particularly empowerment of women. This is where we get rationale for this 15 policy actions, big picture policy actions in these 5 areas that will drive that systems change, that economic systems change. So within the inequality transformation, we're looking at progressive taxation, stronger unions, empowering workforces, and eventually to universal basic dividend. In poverty, international, expand the policy space, reform IMF and World Bank, regionalize trade, particularly in emerging economies, and new growth models based on green energy and regenerative agriculture. On empowerment, education for all, particularly girls and women, female leadership in policy and in within C-suite and leadership of companies, and pensions for all. Transforming the food system, new farming techniques, food system efficiency, changing diets, and energy efficiency, electrify everything, and abundant renewables. So those are the 15 policy actions we need to take. And then on top of that, we need stronger democracies. We need a bigger coalition of the willing around this agenda. And the democracies currently, we would argue, are not working for the majority of people. So what are the possibilities for strengthening democracies and strengthening engagement in international processes too? So how much support is there for this, and going beyond GDP to well-being economies? So essentially, the survey is looking at all of these, which we felt we could measure. What's the support across the G20 countries on this? And just to say now, the book has been published in multiple languages since it was first published in 2022. And the latest version is just out in Spanish. And now I will just pass over to Zoe.
Thank you so much, Owen, and hello, everybody. It's been a really fascinating piece of work we've done here with all of our partners, including Earth for All, and really delighted we get to share this with you today. At the Global Commons Alliance, we're very much focused on Earth system science with a justice lens, and how we can transform societies to live within what we call the safe and just boundaries. And we know that to do that, the safe and just boundaries are designed so that we can have a safe and stable planet that avoids crossing tipping points wherever possible, but also provides the resources and needs for people to live a dignified life free from poverty. So very much aligned with the Earth for All agenda. And as we've looked scientifically at the safe and just boundaries, one thing is really clear, that in order to get within a safe and just space for all of humanity, we have to urgently transform the way that our economies work. We're looking at systems transformation. We're looking at changes to the way we run the economy, and that can mean everything from legislation to different kinds of compensation rules and incentives, to better management and sharing and usage of resources at every level of society. So very much about increasing equality and reducing overconsumption. and investing in sustainable and affordable technologies. So when we had a chance to investigate the public's opinion on economic and political transformations, which are obviously required, it was really fantastic to be able to partner with Earth for All and all the different groups that have come together to do this. So we're really thrilled to be able to share some of the results with you here today. We think that they will lend a lot of weight to everybody out there who's trying to do the right thing and shift our economies, shift the way we live and work, and all the things that we do so that we can live on a safe planet in a just society. So thank you for being here. And I will pass over to Ipsos now, I think, to present the results. Thank you so much.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. I will just share my screen. Can we see that?
Yes, perfect, Mia.
Great, lovely. So yeah, just first off say a big thank you to Owen and Zoe, and thank you all for coming today. We're the Ipsos team. We led on the survey design and my name's Mia. I was the project manager of this, and I'll also be presenting today with my colleague Kat, who also worked on this project throughout. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover today, we're going to give you sort of a top-level summary of the attitudes towards government and the economy, support for policy proposals, the G20 values, and if we've got time, a quick summary of what we've covered at the end. And then just to start us off with the sort of methodology side of things, we were commissioned by Earth for All and their partners to look at attitudes to societal transformations, political economic systems, and planetary stewardship, as you've heard. This report focuses on the attitudes towards national and global political and economic systems and levels of support for Earth for All's policy proposals. So overall for this study, we interviewed 22,000 participants aged between 18 and up to 75, and that was done online. This includes a total of 18,000 participants across 18 G20 countries, that's 1,000 in each country. We interviewed people from all G20 countries, excluding the EU and Russia, where we weren't able to conduct research due to safety concerns there. We did, in addition, conduct research in Austria, Denmark, Kenya, and Sweden, and we used a quota sampling where data was weighted to be representative of the national population on age, gender, and region and working status within those nations. So this report today is going to present the G20 average of country responses, which is an average of national results across the G20 countries surveyed, where the countries all have the same weight. Hope that wasn't too technical. As we go through here, this map will just show you which countries we have surveyed, which are new to the study, and which were actually a continuation of countries that we surveyed back in 2021 as part of a previous Global Commons work as well. Here as well, just for analysis purposes, we grouped some of the countries based on their income level as defined by the World Bank into low, medium and high income, and on their vulnerability to climate change as well, also into low, medium, high. This graph shows which of the countries split there, and just to note, we will be referencing this throughout the presentation. Okay, now on to the first section of this. This is attitudes towards government and the economy. Firstly, just to note that overall economic inequality is an issue for those surveyed in the G20, but the link between this and environmental damage is not firmly established. The belief in economic growth as a driver of well-being also remains high. Notably, though, those who believe themselves to be most exposed to climate threats are the most critical of the economic system, with significantly more agreeing with most of the statements shown on the screen here. Attitudes towards the economic system are also fairly consistent across demographic groups. However, those who are uninterested in politics have lower levels of agreement or, lower engagement with this topic. Whilst criticism of inequality exists across most countries, this belief is stronger in low and middle income countries such as Brazil and Indonesia. Similarly, this slide shows that there is support for wellbeing economies amongst those surveyed in the G20, with 68% agreeing the way the world's economy works should prioritise the health and wellbeing of people and nature, rather than focusing solely on profit and increasing wealth. And 62% agree that the economic success of a country should be measured by the health and wellbeing of its citizens, rather than how fast the economy is growing. As with criticism of inequality, support for wellbeing economies exists across most countries, with this being stronger in low and middle income countries such as Brazil and Indonesia. Across the G20, those surveyed have low levels of trust in their country's government, with 39% saying they trust the with just 39% saying they trust their government to make decisions which benefit the majority, and 37% saying they trust the government to make long-term decisions. Trust in government tends to be lowest in European countries. For example, in France, just 18% agreed that their government can be trusted to make decisions which benefit the majority of people. Trust is also lower among older people and those dissatisfied with their household income as well. There is also support amongst those surveyed in the G20 for reform. So that's both globally and nationally, and of political and economic systems, as you can see on the slide here. There is slightly higher support for national level reform, and support is fairly consistent across key demographics. Support for local reform is highest amongst those exposed to climate risks and those dissatisfied with their household financial situation. Similarly, as we've seen, those who say they're exposed to climate risks are significantly more likely than any other group to say the economic and political system of their country needs complete or major reform. And on a country level, support for national and international reform is highest amongst low and middle income countries. For example, 85% of those in Argentina say the political system of their country needs reform, and 90% say this for the economic reform, for the economic system. We also asked individuals about various types of political systems and asked them whether they thought they'd be good or bad for running their country. Democracy remains by far the most favoured political system amongst those surveyed in the G20, with 81% saying this would be a good way of running the country. And also amongst those surveyed in the G20, around a third say they would rather have bigger government providing more services compared to smaller government. But interestingly, people also believe that there is a responsibility of individuals to provide for themselves. And then finally, for my section, amongst those surveyed in the G20, law and order, good education and free healthcare are seen as the most important things for government to provide in their countries. I'm now just going to hand over to Kat for the next section.
Thanks, Mia. So yeah, I'll be talking through support for policy proposals. These are going to be specifically looking at Earth Rule's 15 policy proposals that Owen mentioned earlier, and also kind of more general proposals around the environment and global political and economic systems. So firstly, just to show that there's the majority of people surveyed across the G20 understand that immediate action within the next decade is needed to tackle the climate change. And this support was high across all countries that we surveyed, but was highest in particular in Mexico, Kenya and South Africa, which could be kind of reflective of environmental meteorological extremes that have happened there in the last couple of years. And among those surveyed in the G20, sorry, just lost my other screen for a second. So yeah, when it comes to funding these changes, we also see strong support for progressive taxation across the G20. So we have around 7 in 10 supporting each of these tax options that we presented in the survey. So this is the highest, support is the highest for polluters paying tax. So there's 71% that support that across the G20. And support for taxation is consistently higher among those who are exposed to climate and environmental risks or threat. And it's also higher among those who say they're politically engaged. So, however, it tends to be, and it also tends to be higher in low and middle income countries as well. So here we have listed out Earth Rule's policy proposals, which Owen touched on earlier. The text is quite small here, so you might not be able to see all of them in detail, but you might notice that 2 of the proposals are missing from this slide, and we'll be touching on them separately. So what this slide is showing is that there's really high support across all of these, all of Earth Rule's policy proposals, with highest support for ensuring free and affordable healthcare. That's 75% of those surveyed supported that. Strengthening workers' rights, again 75%, and investing in renewables, energy efficiency, clean transport and reducing industrial pollution, which was supported by 74%. And when we look across different demographics for support of these policies, we see that the support is highest amongst, again, those who are engaged with climate change and exposed to environmental risks and threats. Also higher among those who are politically engaged. Interestingly, those people who are older, so those above 45 years old, are less supportive of universal basic income than younger age groups, so those under 45. And when we look across different countries, again, low and middle income countries are much more supportive of these proposals than those in high income countries. But we do tend to see majority in all of the countries supporting each of these proposals. And again, like I said just before, we've pulled out these two specific policy proposals. So giving legal rights to nature in national laws and giving legal rights to future generations in national laws. They kind of fall into the middle when we look at them compared to those other proposals that we showed you in the previous slide. And they do also have majority support across the G20 with 60% and 61% supporting each of these proposals. And yeah, again, it's kind of similar groups that are more likely to support these. But we do actually also see that support for giving legal rights to future generations is lower among those aged 55 plus. So support among that age group is at 56% compared to those in younger age groups where support kind of varies between 60 and 64%. And again, so we kind of asked about different mechanisms for engaging citizens in these kind of policies. So as you can see here, again, most people support establishing ways to better involve citizens in international organizations. And the proposal with the highest level of support is global surveys of citizens' attitudes and concerns, followed by citizens' assemblies with 62% and 57% support each. And again, we see kind of support for each of these policies higher in those low and middle income countries. And lastly, I'm just going to cover kind of important values across the G20 countries that we surveyed. So we asked people which values that they would like to teach, that they think children should be encouraged to learn at home. We kind of presented them with a selection of different values that children might be encouraged to learn. And we see that the kind of top values that people select are good manners, tolerance and respect for other people, but you can also see there in fourth place that we've got respect for animals, nature and environment. So 46% say that that's a value that should be encouraged to children. And these top four qualities remain kind of pretty consistent across different countries, but we do see that respect for nature one, so the one that comes in fourth at the G20 level, does rank within the top three in some countries, particularly actually here in the high income countries that are less vulnerable to climate change. So for example, Australia, Austria, Canada, France, the UK and the US. And this is the same data again, but now it's shown with a comparison with the 2021 survey that we carried out for Global Commons. So that was basically, it's quite similar, but the top three values haven't changed in terms of rank. What you might see in that box there on the side is that we can't directly compare the respect for nature one, because we slightly changed the wording between the 2021 survey and this survey. But as you can see, nearly half, 46%, said that respect for animals, nature and the environment was an important value in 2024, whereas in 2021, a third, so 34% selected protection of nature, including the environment. So we do kind of see that increase, but we can't directly compare just because of that slight change in the word. And finally, well, actually not quite finally, I've got one more after this, but we asked people about a battery of kind of core value statements. And here we kind of see that people are generally, well, there's quite high split in terms of people saying that they would of kind of support towards the different two statements on either side of the spectrum. And majorities of people actually lie somewhere in the middle. So if we pick out one, for example, I think one that's particularly of interest in terms of Earth for All's policy proposals is the one that we can see at the bottom, where around a third, so that's 32%, say that they would prefer a bigger government, whereas 15% would prefer a smaller government. But as you can see, even for that one, there's a massive chunk of people that are just in the middle that kind of don't have a strong feeling either way. And finally, people across the G20 tend to be optimistic about their own future. So we can see 62% of those surveyed say they're optimistic about their own future. There's slightly less, well, there's less optimism around the future of their own country. So 44% said they felt optimistic about the future of their own country, and also even lower optimism about the future of the world, with 38% feeling optimistic. Those in low and middle income countries tend to be more optimistic across each of these different areas. And now I think I'm going to hand back over to Mia to do a quick summary of findings.
You are indeed. In the interest of time, I am really going to whiz through these, but this is just everything that we have covered today, sort of brought together. So firstly, just to note that there is support for wellbeing economies amongst those surveyed in the G20, and economic inequality is also seen as a problem amongst this group. Only a small amount of those surveyed showed trust in government to be able to tackle those issues and act in their best interests, either in the short or in the long term. And also that there is support for reform of national and global political and economic systems amongst this group as well, with slightly more support for reform at the national level. There's also a belief in economic growth as a driver of well-being, and this remains high amongst those surveyed in the G20. Trust as well is lowest in Europe, plus Japan, Turkey and South Africa, as well as lower and higher middle income countries who tend to be more aware of economic inequality and supportive of wellbeing economies. Attitudes towards economic systems are also fairly consistent across demographic groups in the G20. And then finally, amongst those surveyed, there is a clear awareness of the urgency of the need to act to reduce carbon emissions, and there is support for each of Earth for All's policy proposals amongst those surveyed in the G20. There's also support for progressive taxation, that polluter pays tax that Kat mentioned there, and this would be used to fund major changes to the economy and lifestyles amongst those surveyed. And finally, the majority of people in the G20 support giving legal rights to nature and future generations to help us tackle these issues. And then just a thank you from us. So I think we are passing back over to the panel, if that's right.
That's right. Thanks, Mia. Thanks, Kat. Thanks for a very, really great presentation on the findings. And it's a really, really good summary. I think you're under time as well, according to my calculations. So all good. And I should say as well, so the survey has produced a huge amount of data. You can see this here. We also have the data available as breakdowns country by country, which are available on our websites. I think we're putting these in the chat at the moment. We can send you links afterwards. In fact, everything you've seen is in the first report that we're publishing today. We sent to the media last night. Then we're going to, but this the whole survey's generated so much data. We'll be publishing a second report later this year, just before the Summit for the Future in early September. which is more on the state of the planet and attitudes to issues like ecocide, for example. And we'll do a segmentation of the global audience according to attitudes to planetary stewardship, and some very exciting findings there. But now we're going to have a panel, and on the panel we have Zoe, who's already who introduced at the start. We have Michael Weatherreed from the Wellbeing Alliance and Aish Machani from ISWI. And Wellbeing Alliance, ISWI, and the Policy Institute at King's are our three additional partners on this project. But Michael, maybe over to you first for any reflections on this survey.
Yeah, thank you, Owen. It's just a quick correction. It's Weatherhead. It's Weatherhead, but it's the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And I had seen actually in one of the slides there was Wellbeing Alliance and Wellbeing Economy Alliance. There might be another Wellbeing Alliance out there, but I didn't know. Just wanted to make that clear. Owen, how long do you want? Because I've been taking notes. It was really, really interesting. Thank you all to those who were presenting, and I've been sort of furiously taking notes in terms of sort of really interesting points. But I could go on quite short or longer.
It's 5 or 6 minutes. How does that sound?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I'll just go through those kind of three groupings and just give some general reflections. So the general, the policies, and then the G20 values, if that's okay. Really interesting, that finding. And I've seen these a little bit. I was in Iceland at the Wellbeing Economy Forum with Sandrine from the Club of Rome a couple of weeks ago, and she was giving a bit of a taster of some of these, but she sort of flew through them. So I didn't really get a chance to dig into them, whereas this was a really very useful presentation, and I could really get my head around some of the results. I thought a very interesting one in terms of general was how you said that the strongest support for some of this stuff is in countries which perhaps have some of the weakest democratic institutions, and also are not the most powerful in terms of some of the global institutions, the decision-making arenas around the world. And I was just pondering, how do we manage that? How do we bring that support that exists amongst those populations to bear? How do we leverage that, given the fact that there is this disparity between the countries they're in and the power perhaps that country wields? So that was a first reflection. I also thought it was very interesting, the self-improvement component. So there was a kind of a bit of a message there that it cannot be about big government, the nanny state, if you like, which is a very UK term. I don't know how well that translates for other audiences, but this need to balance this idea of self-improvement. And I think it's a really interesting one, because I think we need to get away, and this also talked to one of your other questions around big government versus small government, is getting away from this idea that government is either just huge in terms of spending money or it's just very parsimonious. You know, it needs to be a government that is highly effective in the way that it enables people to take responsibility for themselves, but gives them the enabling architecture. And I think it's a very different framing to the sort of big government spending wise, small government spending wise. So I thought that was a really interesting point too. Not surprising, depressing, but not surprising, the level of trust in governments, in terms of governments helping rectify some of the problems that had been identified. I mean, my personal take is the fact that we've seen a lack of genuinely forceful policies, really impactful policies. There's been so much timidity, there's been so much incrementalism, certainly in the UK. I mean, for those who have to suffer living here along with me, you know, you get endless talks about a penny on the income tax or a penny off. And, you know, these are not policies that genuinely nudge it. And I'm not surprised, therefore, to see that. I mean, there's a whole raft of other reasons why there's a lack of trust, but I do think a lack of really impactful policy making is possibly behind that. So that's a really important lesson. Going into the policies a little bit, I found it really interesting that the polluter pay one was the most supported. I mean, that really talks to efforts to go beyond GDP. I mean, at the very bare minimum, it's to sort of take GDP to one which actually accounts for the environmental negatives that are created and yet are not recognized in GDP. And that naturally sort of would then, if we had that newer framing, that would, I think, automatically go down towards more of that. Okay, we need to recognize the costs, and that cost needs to be accounted for and ultimately paid for. So that was very encouraging. And I think it certainly plays into some of the policies that we're pushing at the G20 level and in other arenas where we're looking for a replacement of that GDP framework, which is so crude and so just does not take into consideration these environmental damages as well as, of course, the societal ones. Really interesting as well that, you know, the things that folk experience daily, so this need for good access to health, workers' rights, local pollution, reduction in local pollution, transport, are these kind of, again, UK phrasing, these bread and butter issues that people experience. So really interesting to see that if you use the language of the things that matter to people in their daily lives, you know, that's what they really appeal to. I wasn't concerned or worried that things such as, let me see here, the rights for nature and the future generations was perhaps one step back. Very positive that it's around 60%, but perhaps not surprising that it wasn't quite as high as those free healthcare, workers' rights, because these are ideas where people have not necessarily experienced them yet. You know, the rights for nature, it's still a slightly sort of abstract concept for many. So the fact that even in an abstract form, it has real support, I thought was very positive, but I'm not surprised. And it just, I think it also made me think that the more, and this also comes through with the citizens' assemblies, the more people can get to experience these, and the more we can show what these means. Just 2 weeks ago, I was mentioning I saw Sandrine at the Wellbeing Economy Forum in Iceland. Well, at that forum, I was also talking about business and power in business and how there were certain businesses which had actually built into their legal structures the rights of nature. And one of the examples was Faith in Nature, who had actually made nature a part of their board, a voting director on their board. And so the more people actually see examples of this stuff in practice, I think that that number will only increase in terms of support for these types of things. And I can't get away from the fact that I wondered if the tolerance, going to the values point, the tolerance of non-humans in this world, you know, it does sort of lay the groundwork for the fact that the rights of nature are the sort of, for the 21st century, what human rights have been for the 20th century, if you like. So I sort of see that connection there between the values and the other ones. But yeah, I mean, coming back to those questions that I think we asked to be included. So thank you for including them around things like rights of nature and also future generations. I mean, these are clear asks, and also around another, this will be my final point, around wealth. These are all policy areas that I think can make real progress in the short to medium term to support the systemic changes that we're all looking for, you know, in the not too long distant future. But just my final point, was fascinating to see how taxes, whether they were income or wealth, so more income tax, more wealth tax for the higher were up there. There wasn't that much difference, I think, if I remember rightly, between those. And yet I think it's the wealth tax, which is clearly the next big ask, and the shift, of course, because we, for example, at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we're not supportive of income tax per se. I mean, wealth is where the vast inequality is ballooning, if you like. So this greater focus on wealth, even if the numbers don't suggest that it is massively supported over and above income tax changes, that's where I think there's real potential. And that was certainly one of our policy pushes for the G20 this year. But I'll leave it there. Thanks, Owen.
Wow, thank you, Michael. That was a fantastic summary of thoughts on it. I'm tempted to go to Aish next for your reflections, and then maybe myself and Zoe and Mia and Kat will give some responses or thoughts back on your reflections.
Thanks, Owen. Bit of a tough act to follow. I think, Michael, that was a bit of a tour de force summary of the survey results. I'm not really sure how to top that. But no, it's a real kind of pleasure to be here. And I mean, yeah, really fantastic survey results and presentation. I think I'm going to focus a bit more on this idea of system change and democratic innovation that kind of comes out of the survey results. So I think, first of all, important to highlight that this comes at a really critical time. I think has already been alluded to, but this year is a year when half about half the world's population is voting. And I think it's been praised as this huge exercise of democracy and the right to vote. But actually, I think what this survey shows us is that for many people, the right to vote actually isn't being seen as enough. But so over 60% of people want kind of radical changes of their own political system, and about 60% also want the same thing for the global political system. And much like Michael, having the misfortune of living in the UK, I can completely understand it, and why that people have lost trust in their governments, and that being the way for people to make for how decisions are made. But I think what's also really interesting is that this survey shows us that people want to play a more active role in governance. They're not just saying we're fed up with what's happening, but that they want to be given more of a say. So we saw that over 60% of people support the use of citizens' assemblies at a national level, and at a global level, there's kind of over 60% of support for global surveys, for global referenda, and for UN Parliamentary Assembly, and for a global citizens' assembly. I mean, this is really exciting for us at the ISWE Foundation, because we've kind of long believed that citizens' assemblies are a way of addressing the shortcomings of our electoral system and building the kind of civic infrastructure that we need for democratic systems change. And I mean, this survey shows that actually quite a lot of other people do as well. And I think what's especially interesting, as was highlighted, was that the strongest levels of support for citizens' assemblies and other democratic innovations are actually not in high-income countries, but in low and medium-income countries, and in countries that have quite high levels of vulnerability to climate change. And I think the reason that this is so interesting is that democratic innovation is often seen as being a distraction or a luxury from the more kind of bread and butter fundamental challenges facing people in the majority world. But this data shows us that people in the majority world don't see it as a distraction, but rather a prerequisite for the kind of systems change that we need to actually address those fundamental bread and butter issues. And so then, kind of speaking generally, so the takeaways then, I think this data gives strength to the argument that we need democratic system change at all levels. And it shows also that there is a real appetite for democratic innovation, contrary to perception, from people in low and medium income countries. And I think specifically for ISWE Foundation, it validates what we've been doing to support citizens' assemblies at all levels, and especially on the work that we've been doing to advocate for a permanent global citizens' assembly, on which actually there really hadn't been very much data before this. And this is going to be really valuable for us as we make the case for democratic innovations in the lead up to the Summit of the Future, which is supposed to be this huge moment where the UN is thinking about how it's going to be reinvigorated and how the multilateral system can become more networked and inclusive, but so far hasn't really given space to discussions about how we can strengthen citizen participation in global governance. It's also going to be really valuable whilst we recruit member states and UN agencies for the Coalition for a Global Citizens Assembly that we're building. And it's going to be valuable as we kind of launch a Global Citizens Assembly for People and Planet, which we're hoping that will land at COP30. And really interestingly, I think it also gives us a clue about the kind of results that we might see from these citizens' assemblies. I mean, the stuff that's coming out about people wanting to criminalize ecocide, or about frustration at inaction on climate change. I think it gives us hope also that not only can these institutions be kind of supported and established, but if they are, they could actually lead to quite radical and positive results, I think, as a whole. I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Aish. That was fantastic. That's a really, really good summary. And I do think, again, there's this clear, strong support for political reform at the international level. Certainly with the ideas we tested, we can see that coming through. And at the national level as well. And it's not just on climate change, it's that whole economic systems change angle. I remember speaking to your colleague Claire Mellier about the French National Assembly and the first day, at the tables, every table wanted to talk about economic systems change, but it wasn't within the remit of the assembly to do that, so it wasn't possible. But it was certainly on people's minds, and we can see that here. I mean, I think the general point I'd make from both of your comments is that, you know, the survey shows a very, very strong support for very strong policies. You know, the urgency to act is there. You know, 71% of people across G20, you know, and rising much higher in emerging economies, want action this decade. They believe major transformation is needed in all sectors this decade, you know, this critical decade for the planet. That is such an important finding. That's such an important political finding that politicians really need to hear, that the level of support for that. But then when we also then balance that with, and then on top of that, so you have political reform, big support for political reform, and a lack of trust in government. So then we can also show that while people support democracies, actually people also don't dismiss authoritarian leadership as a style of government. That quite a large support, something like 40% across G20 countries, don't think it's a bad way to run a government. So so we have to constantly litigate, you know, in the court of public opinion for democracies, that these are effective ways of doing things. But I also think this goes to show the far right agenda of tear it all down. We're going to have complete transformation, drain the swamp. That message really carries through, and we haven't tested this, but I'm speculating from the results in some ways that that while people want reform, the right wing give a very simple message on reform that resonates, and this is why it resonates. People feel economically insecure. They feel governments aren't giving back to them. So I do think there is a moment for a more progressive agenda to put out a much stronger message on economic transformation and political transformation that could be supported. But so I'm going to pass over to Zoe and then to Mia and Kat for some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. I just want to really pick up on this urgency point that Owen just talked about. 71% of people on average across the G20 countries surveyed who want action right now, immediately this decade. I mean, to me, that is a mandate for action now for all leaders, political leaders, but in particular also, I think, you know, it's relevant for a business audience. We haven't talked about them as much, but they're a huge part of the economy. They play a huge role in politics, and we've seen news over the past couple of weeks that companies are kind of dropping their climate commitments or skipping them or backtracking on them because it's too hard to reduce emissions. This is not what people want. People don't want backtracking. They want action now. So I think the urgency message can be interpreted broadly as a mandate for action right now. And it's really, really important that that message carries through. And on the international reform, I'm really hoping that these findings about public support for multilateral international reform carry through at the Summit of the Future that will happen in New York in September. It will be the middle weekend of the UN General Assembly. There's a big conversation there about multilateral reform, the UN system. There'll be a big contingent of young people there trying to shape the future so that it can be just, equitable and safe. And so I think for them, it's really important to see that this across, you know, lots of different age groups, that we have got support for multilateral reform. And now it's a question of, you know, courage and leadership. We need to see this being adopted and translated into courageous leadership across the political and business arena. And we really hope to see more of that, because the crisis is obviously severe. We've got billions of people who've been living under heat stress over the past few days. It's diabolical. And Owen, you touched on this really, really early on. So a mandate for action now is the way that I interpret these results. Really, really critical, and multilateral reform is supported. So let's make it happen. And to all the people who are listening, all the work that you're doing to support that, you can draw from these results to show that you've got support for that work. The only other thing I'd say is there is a little bit of confusion among the public around the relationship between economic growth, health and well-being, and the state of the planet. I think that means that people who are working on systems change, people who are working on economic transformations and connecting well-being to a different way of accounting for things, we need to do a lot more work on the messaging around that so that people of all stripes can really understand the consequences of pursuing economic growth at all costs. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Zoe. Yes, and so Mia and Kat, maybe you want to touch on that question as well, on that confusion in the minds of the public potentially.
Yeah, no, I definitely do think that one of the key takeaways from the survey for me actually is how there is still a lot of confusion and perhaps a bit of misunderstanding, or perhaps not linking that these sort of for example, the one that I'm thinking of mainly is that point about the economic change. The link to the environment just was not established and was only seen by a small amount of people. I think just to echo some of the other points as well, I also have the misfortune of living in England, and it's so interesting to see how strongly reform is felt. But also I just think this has given me such hope actually for change. I think it's a real takeaway point for me that this is so positive and so wonderful that people are thinking these things and they're having these the sort of this level of understanding is out there. And so yeah, I'll just leave it there. Is that I actually think this is an overall a really positive piece, and I'd be keen to continue to see what it looks like in the future.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Mia said there, I think for me the key takeaway is that 71% are saying that we need to act now, that we need to act in the next 10 years. We see much lower levels of support for acting in 20 to 30 years or in more than 30 years, but there are still groups that are saying that we need to act in 20 to 30 years or more than 30 years. And I guess it's like, just to note that something else that Ipsos are doing with all of our partners led by Earth for All is also kind of a segmentation of different groups using these survey findings to kind of pull apart a bit more, because obviously what is published already and what you can go and access now on the Earth for All website is the global report, which has, as well as the slides we presented today, it also has kind of breakdowns of the different results that we found across the different countries. So you can really pull apart where there were differences across different countries, including some of those points that we highlighted earlier about actually low and middle income countries often showing much higher levels of support for specific policy areas. So yeah, do have a look at those slides and do kind of pull out the parts that are most interesting for you and most useful for your audiences. But yeah, also I guess just to say that there is kind of further analysis going on in the background to kind of understand, well, which are the groups that think we should act now, which are the groups that don't, which are the groups that will support these kind of policies more than others. So yeah, I think that's kind of my final point that I wanted to make off the back of that.
We're saying watch this space is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks, Mia. And just, I mean, a further reflection on one of Michael's points earlier on tax and the polluter pays question that's coming out as the strongest. But in reality, that all the tax proposals we gave to the survey had extremely strong results. So it's all within like a few percentage points of each other. So a big effort on redistribution is strongly supported. So I can just go over to the questions now in the chat, and if anyone wants to raise their hand, if that's possible, and ask directly, or I'm going to start reading some of the questions here. Sebastian asks, what does giving legal rights to nature and future generations mean? Provide some examples. Well, the question we asked was very, very general. It was exactly like that. We didn't really have time or space to go into explanations, and there's so many different ways that political systems democracies are experimenting with giving rights to future generations and nature, whether it's through setting up commissions, whether it's setting up guardianships, whether it's setting up some sort of legal entity for a river or a mountain, with committees sitting on that legal entity with responsibility. So we didn't. These kinds of things are for further surveys. Nigel, you have a long question in here. I don't know if you want to speak out. If it's...
Hello there, can you hear me now?
Oh yes, we can. Hi Nigel.
Fantastic.
Great,
Yes,
it's great you can join.
I know the last survey had talked about the need for, or the fact that most people support the need for urgent action on climate change, but also believe that most people don't agree with them. And this survey draws out that people feel quite confident about their own prospects, at least in the richer part of the world, but much less positive about the outlook for their countries. And that made me wonder, is there support in this survey for the idea that we need to make these investments in a manner that's inclusive, i.e. for there to be a level of altruism and to help others? Because there's a bit of a sense that, well, I'm all right, but I'm not sure about everybody else. Does that make sense? I'm putting that very well.
Yeah, I mean, I had a thought on this, having kind of seen your question in the chat, Nigel. I'm not sure we kind of specifically asked about that, and that we can specifically kind of talk to your point about kind of altruism. But I guess one thing that I did reflect on is that we do see kind of high levels of, so the various kind of taxation policies that we presented people to in the survey included higher wealth tax and higher income tax on high earners. And we did see high support for those policies among high earners and among kind of high income countries as well. So I guess, I mean, that's just the first thing that comes to my mind. I'm not sure that's the most graceful answer to your question, but yeah, I guess we do see kind of people showing some level of altruism in terms of supporting higher tax when they themselves would then be impacted by that policy.
Yeah, and I think that's also supported by some research, a survey that was published in Nature Climate Change back in January, I think, showing people generally were willing to pay a little bit more income tax to address the issue. It certainly wasn't rejected across a lot of income groups. But as you say, Kat, we weren't testing that specifically. We were more testing just redistribution of wealth and how that was supported. And as you say, it gets surprising support from the wealthy in society. So there is some altruistic indicators happening there. So Gonzalo, okay, G20 values. Okay, about this, the values we're seeing and the fact that the extreme right is gaining so much space in some of those countries. Any reflections on that? On what the survey says about of this potential contradiction that we're just seeing more support for the far right. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just happy to share a reflection. I mean, it really is striking that polluter pays principle, and yet it's not applied multilaterally or in many countries unilaterally, and yet it would almost feel that it's the sort of simple, clear message which appeals to that base instinct around fairness, that if you're the one making the mess, you're the one who should be cleaning it up afterwards. And that can't be a simpler message, and it absolutely resonates with people. But the trouble is, people are not seeing that type of action by those who are considered progressive politicians, and that frustration then leads them to consider other alternatives. And this is a maddening sort of delay or lack of political will to enact these types of changes, which I think would people, and the survey backs it up, and multiple other sort of evidence indicates that people would be up for that, and that would give them confidence that those that they put into power, who are deemed more progressive, do in fact enact the sort of progressive policies that they were there put into to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what, and specifically with the polluter pays question, we asked about, the addition to it was a redistribution of that money to people who are not polluting as much. So yeah, I agree that, and it's the standard economic solution to this. Yet it's not being enacted, and it seems very, very difficult to create any sort of global agreement on it. That said, I suppose there's also looking at the French situation with the Gilets jaunes, and how if you don't implement a policy like that sensitively, it can backfire in all sorts of different directions, which may be playing out right now in the elections in France. So
that comes to the point about fairness, though, doesn't it, Owen? Because it wasn't applied in a way which was fair, because those who are least able to bear the burden felt that they had that burden putting upon them, and so it was just badly designed. And again, it comes back to you need to have sort of fairness sort of through the center of the policy, and if you're not carefully thinking about it, then you can you think one step forward, but then suddenly you're two back.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what we wanted to test across the board was, policies that we would consider fair policies. Do other people consider them fair and support them? And I think we get this very positive response. Mike Jones asks about correlating our results with what's being offered by political parties in the various elections this year. We haven't started that yet. I think it's we're only in a kind of ad hoc way looking at in the UK, for example, or in France, are the kind of policies we're suggesting coming through in manifestos. And I think the reality is, for the mainstream parties, nowhere near strong enough. There's I can't think of any mainstream political party that is putting these types of policies forward. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that. What would be the
in the UK or wider?
Anywhere, Michael.
I mean, I do know there's if you remember in the UK, so those outside the UK may not know, Gina Miller, the lady who took, I think, the British government to court around Brexit, she's set up a new party. It's certainly, so it's therefore not mainstream, but she certainly reached out to us at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance to say we're very interested in these types of policies. Now, of course, we're non-party political. We want all politicians to be adopting this, but you see it in snippets in different areas. And I do know that our Welsh hub in one of the more recent Senate elections did actually do an analysis of where the political parties lay in relation to wellbeing economy ideas. And our New Zealand hub also held a conference just before their recent election last year, where they actually had different politicians in effect talking to why they are or not aligned to a wellbeing economy in the policies.
And Christian, you have a question on dystopian green messaging. Do you want to say it?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Good. I was not sure I can speak. Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking about the recent results, for example, for the EU Parliament elections and what we see in different countries. Even the youth is turning away from green parties and the policies they promote. And I was just wondering what if you have any suggestions how that can be turned around, because in my view, this is also related to the dystopic framing of the climate crisis and people being anxious about their future and turning to parties that offer supposedly simple solution to the problem, which is the right wing and the populists. So I was thinking, how can we frame this whole thing and the future in a more positive way to bring the public along?
Well, I would like to throw this to Zoe and Aish for any thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a good question. And because of the way the media reports on climate, it's very, very easy, I think, for most of us to envision the future with fires and floods and droughts. And, we've seen images that make it, you can see and almost feel what it's like. There are very few images or stories that depict what a well-being economy would look like. We do have some words, but I think it's very difficult for people to see what would my job look like, what would my days look like, what would the political situation look like, what would my city look like, and we just don't have enough of that. And I know that Owen at Earth for All, you've done some amazing work on envisioning the futures of 4 girls, which for all of you, if you can put a link in the chat, if Earth for All could put a link in the chat to that visioning, it's really beautiful. And at the Global Commons Alliance, we've done also some scientific visioning with a design futures agency called Superflux, which created scientifically based images of what the future would look like if we lived in safe and just boundaries in certain parts of the world, in a river basin, in a particular city, and so on. And so that kind of work is really important, and telling the stories of how it will look and feel so that people can envision it. That's really important. And the stories of solutions. I'm at London Climate Action Week here in London this week. Last night I went to an event talking about the stories of possibilities, and the truth is that for the media, they've admitted it over and over again, if it bleeds, it leads. They tend to cover the stuff that is dystopian because it attracts more attention. But the solution stories are really powerful. So we've got to get good at telling them. We've got to work together to provide not just stories, but also visuals of what this future looks like, so that people don't just see door A that we can go through, but that they can see a real route through door B. So I really hope that if anyone is out there working on those images of the future, visions of the future, can really share and bring those to the fore. And I think everybody in the school would be really happy to amplify those. But the more we can have, and the more political parties can talk about that, the less easy it will be for people to fall out of love with green policies, because if they're not described in a way that they can see their future as being benefited, as opposed to feeling like things are being taken away, then we will continue to lose. But Owen, do you want to talk a bit about the 4 girls, and then maybe you could come in as well on that?
Yeah, so this is part of the book. We sort of envisage the lives of 4 girls born in 2020, what their lives might how they might unfold in the different scenarios. And I think Lena's put the visualizations we've created in the chat, and we'll hopefully be taking those narratives to the Summit of the Future, and having some deep discussions around them. Aish, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, completely seconding everything that Zoe and Owen said about visualizing the future. I think for the first Global Citizens Assembly we ran it in 2021, we worked closely with artists there, and I think that more than anything really helped to capture the imagination about the potential of a Global Citizens Assembly as a solution. I think maybe just maybe like slightly to challenge the premise of the question, I'm not sure if it's just that we only see dystopian visions of dystopian visions that people turn away from green parties, but I think it's that people are also maybe a kind of turning away in general from single issue parties were focused on the environment, given, I guess, the context of the wider like economic crisis and cost of living crisis that are facing people in Europe. So I think related to that, I think there's an exercise that needs to be doing in kind of making people aware of how closely the environment and nature relates to their own lives and their own well-being kind of economically. And that's something that we have been trialing as we've been developing learning materials for people who participate in citizens' assemblies. So whether it's pictorial representations of humans' interconnectedness with nature, or it's like anchoring exercises where people talk about the lives of their ancestors and potential descendants in relation to the environment around them, kind of making people more aware of the way that their wider lifestyles interact with the environment around them, I think is really valuable. Thanks.
And also, I wonder if Kat or Mia have any reflections as well on because what surprised me was the optimism question was really interesting. It's like, and there's actually a YouGov poll, I think, out today as well on this optimism pessimism question that I was surprised how high, people's personal optimism is very high everywhere, and particularly in places like India and Mexico and Kenya, and just less so in Europe, the most stable, well-functioning democracies in the world with the highest standard of living. People's personal optimism is relatively low. How do we make sense of that? But then optimism for the country and the world sinks lower and lower.
I think it really speaks to some of that disconnect again that we have been seeing. I think for me, it's like, yeah, I'm all right. My life's all right. Everything's all right. And then you sort of ask those bigger questions and you maybe delve a little bit further into what's actually happening and what people think. And it sort of gets teased out that way, that perhaps everything's not quite as all right as they had immediately thought, thinking in sort of in a more longer term way. I think it speaks back to that point that we were talking about earlier, Owen, about that sort of, there are some sort of conflicts, I guess, in the data here, which this is one of them. I think it's a sort of personal conflict. But yeah, Kat, did you have anything to add?
I think also just to reflect on the fact that actually a lot of those differences in terms of optimism and pessimism are quite cultural, are quite kind of cultural differences which are ingrained into the different countries that we surveyed. I mean, for example, in India, we do tend to see kind of more positive outlooks on anything when we were in surveys done there. In France and the UK, for example, we tend to see more negative viewpoints in general. And I think, yeah, it is interesting that, that those are, you might expect that people might feel more positive in, say, France, where, it's richer and there are lots of like very good policies that are supporting people. But yeah, basically what I'm trying to say is this is a cultural phenomenon that we do tend to see across kind of global surveys, which is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, and just to add to that actually as well, in the UK, people tend to think the country's perhaps headed in the wrong direction. So maybe have less hope for the country in general than they do for themselves. So again, yeah. Yeah,
and I think, without doubt, countries like India and Brazil and South Africa, they have gone through a lot of economic change over the last few years and last few decades, and that development. A lot of people will be coming out of poverty still with huge inequalities. But if you're better off than your parents and grandparents and getting a better education, etc., you probably have a more optimistic outlook than this sort of more status quo. So I'm going to see, Guy has a question. Is there any specific data on individuals who reply with some sort of status quo response? Such as don't know or no change? Well, we do have all that data. We haven't done any analysis on it, but and in some areas it is interesting. But in fact, most of the questions, I think there's a very low level, very small percentage of people who say no or don't know. Maria Emanuela Galanti, would you like to ask your question on IDGs, Inner Development Goals?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the question is if there is any reflection on your side on the work that needs to be done on the inner dimension. So I refer to the 23 IDG skills that are, in my opinion, important to empower and work towards resilience of people. Is there any way to connect the inner and the outer dimension into societal and economic transformation?
So I mean, my short answer on that, and I'll pass it over to Mia and Kat and others on it, is that there was one question we asked in the survey, and we also asked it in the first survey in 2021 on long-term values. And this was a survey. This question came from the World Values Survey, which has been running for 40 odd years. It's been produced every 6-7 years, and they've been asking this question. What values do you teach your children as a way of getting at people's long-term values? Very interestingly, in the World Values Survey, in the long list of values, they don't have nature or climate or the environment or protection of these of nature. That was excluded, which also gives some indication of the values of the people who created the survey 40 years ago. So we included it in the last 2 surveys, and it's reasonably high. It's 3rd or 4th place in this survey. So people value it. Protection of nature much more than religion, for example. So I think that's quite interesting. Maybe, I mean, I guess that's in terms of inner development, that's that sort of long-term value around nature. Other parts of the inner development, are we testing? We're probably doing less testing on that, to be honest. I don't know, Kat or Mia, if you have any reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to pick up on the point that you've already raised, Owen, which is that 46% across the G20 said that they would encourage children to have that value of respecting animals, nature, and the environment. And we found 34% supporting a very similar statement that we added in 2021, which is the one that I said we changed the wording, so we can't quite talk about the direct comparison there. But yeah, it's the 4th top value that we found on that list, and a lot higher in some of the countries that we surveyed. It actually comes in 3rd for some of the countries. So again, a lot kind of higher than other values like independence, hard work, religious values.
Okay, and we have another question on do we see any remarkable difference or similarity of responses between countries in the north and south? So we could talk about this for a long time. Actually, there's in all the data, there's a lot of interesting stories there. I don't know if Mia or Kat, you want to give any thoughts on that? Or anyone else? No one's jumping in, but I mean, it's essentially the one of the key findings is that if you're coming from an emerging economy, you're more likely to want action, to believe that where the risks are higher, and want to do something about it. So I mean, that's coming across loud and clear, that it seems that people who are more insulated, probably by wealth, in the emerging, in the wealthy economies of Europe and North America, still want action, but there is a gap generally between those two groups. And places like Sweden, for example, it's surprising the gap between Sweden and some of the emerging economies. Mike, do you want to ask your question? Mike Jones and Margaret on. Do you want to come in with your questions? And Margaret's question has disappeared. Ah, Mike. Margaret, yes.
Sorry, my question, thanks so much for this wonderful presentation. My question was just asking someone to get in touch or to, so it was less about the presentation itself, I'm sorry. But I've really been enjoying all the, listening to all the findings. Thank you.
Okay, oh, good to hear. Thanks. I just saw your name and then the question disappeared. So, and Mike, you have a question on polluter pays principle.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, super, thank you. Yeah, I've been in the environmental game for a very long time now, and it's always been one of these things that people who are concerned with the environment say should happen, but it very rarely does. Michael made a good point, I think, about the unfairness of the way it might be distributed amongst certain sectors of society, but I think there's an awful lot more to it than that. And it's probably, again, a deeply cultural thing, is that we're so used to using nature and getting a lot of stuff for free without any real thought about the consequences. And I guess my concern about this is if we're really going to create the kinds of transformation that we're all working towards, this is one of the issues that we need to address in one way or another.
Zoe, any reflections there?
Yeah, I mean, there's the story of sort of incrementalism, isn't there, about how these things gain traction over many years, and it can feel like things haven't happened, even though we've all been working on this for a long time. But things really are changing. There's been some fantastic legal wins, and the support for polluter pays is something that will grow until it reaches the point where it's unavoidable. I don't see that if we think about where we are now and look forward 10 years, it's impossible to think that won't be the norm across the whole of the economy. If we look back 10 years ago from where we are now in terms of the exponential scale of technologies that have improved, we couldn't have imagined where we would be on that. So I think it can be difficult to appreciate just when the tipping points come for certain things. So my sense is that polluter pays tax is unavoidable. It's in certain manifestos of different political parties. People want it. It's just a matter of time. And I just believe that things are moving faster than we think, faster than the media would want us to believe. There's a lot of work behind the scenes, so I would expect it to come in much sooner than we thought, and that all the work that's been done over the years has not been wasted.
No, thanks, Zoe. Thanks. Now I'm looking at Eddie Harris's question on private versus public wealth, and we didn't test that. We don't have any sort of insights or opinions on that from the survey. That would need sort of further work. As to I'll leave that there. And Ron has a question then on let's see. And actually, this might be a question for Nigel, if you're still on. Is it realistic to think there could be a significant change in overall economic systems or response to climate unless we take effective action to rein in speculation in financial stock and commodity markets? Nigel.
I'll give half an answer to this question. I don't know if I can answer it all, but in terms of deployment of capital into anything around renewable energy, there is a huge amount of capital available for some types of projects, i.e. things that are not particularly risky in using well-established technologies. And that's a big part of what's needed, and the capital flowing into these types of opportunities now is approaching $2 trillion a year, which is not enough, but it's not massively far short of the number that's needed. And all of that is done within the existing investment paradigm, without trying to change anything. Those things simply become economic. The big gap, of course, is in the global south, where huge risk premiums are being expected. And of course, that means that if those projects do get implemented, they'll benefit the investors, but they won't really benefit local communities in anything like the way that's need it. So that's kind of a fairly positive view on the financing part for some of this. But there are barriers, and again, there are barriers to deployment in some areas too. So that's helpful.
Yes, it is. I suppose it's very helpful, although I suppose we're drifting a little off topic. But we are coming up to time now, and I'd just like to say thanks to everyone for joining the call today. Thanks to Lena for organising it. Thanks to Zoe, Michael, Aish for joining, and most of all, thanks to Mia and Kat and the whole team at Ipsos, who have done an absolutely incredible job. It's been a real pleasure working with you all for the last 6 months. And I can't believe how far we've come. All to say, the results are now out. We hope we'll be building up media momentum and discussion on these issues in the run-up to the G20 finance ministers meeting towards the end of July. And we really want these findings to also resonate with the elections happening right now in France and the UK and elsewhere. We have a second report coming out in early September, and in the run-up to the Summit for the Future, with some very, very exciting findings in there too, which we've teased a little bit today. But other than that, Lena, is there anything I'm missing?
No, I think we've covered it all. Thank you everyone for joining. Remember that you can find a breakdown of the country results as well as everything we've covered today on our website. So we very much encourage you to go through that again, but very much also use it in your own organizations to push our common message. So thank you all for joining.